Welcome. We're going to be looking at, in this video today, we're going to be looking at letter writing, and we're going to be looking at the various types of, obviously, styles that you're looking at, but also really actually looking at how to write a letter properly. Now, when you're writing a letter, now this is something you probably would have been doing since primary school, where you'd be writing a letter to an editor or to someone else, and going about all the things that you've been asked to do in the question. And yes, it is a creative response because it is allowing you to do it in your own way, in your own form, in your own point of view. However, often when you're asked to write a letter, you'd be asked to do so in relation to a text or something that you've studied, and so you have to include those aspects as well. So we're going to be looking at that, and we're going to be looking at a number of different things to do with a letter and how to organize it. So not only do you have a letter which follows the correct structure and has appropriate language, but also so it's interesting as well, and that it's not going to bore someone to death the second they pick it up. So let's have a look at it. All right. Now, as I said, there's a creative response that takes a variety of forms, although both, or all the forms, should I say, follow roughly the same principle. Whether it is a letter to the editor, an email, if anyone still does that, if anyone still does a letter to the editor for that matter, or otherwise, the structure is very much the same, and you'll see a variety of different questions posed as a letter, but they're still following essentially the same idea. And the same idea is the old-fashioned letter, which is you have a dear, to, and from, and then everything else that goes in between is up to you. Now, the one thing which does sort of vary what the type of structure it is, and certainly varies the type of language which is used, is essentially its audience, who is the receiver of your message. So whoever this to is will dictate what kind of language you use. But first, before we go into that, we'll look at structure first. Now, as I said, before or between the to and from, the way you structure a letter response is up to you. And that there's no set structure. You must organize your work, of course. And this is the same with everything. You have to do things like include paragraphs. And this is really crucial because of the fact that, as I said, you need to be able to organize it so someone can read it. Now, even if you write messages to people and they're completely and utterly incomprehensible, that may be good if you're writing to someone else that you know, but if you're writing something for English, it must be organized, it must be neat and tidy, and that you're able to follow it from one point to another. So, you need to make sure that it is organized, but everything else you do is up to you, and you can organize it in such a way where it just brings out what you're trying to say in a much clearer and much organized fashion than what you would have if you were just to ramble it out. Now, it isn't an essay either. So as long as you make it clear, you can write it essentially however you like. And it should also, it can and should have a personal opinion attached. And even if it's formal, you can still attach a personal opinion to it. So it doesn't really matter what it is you're writing, because it is writing from you or from the perspective of someone else. It should take on some form of personal opinion. And so when you're looking at it, and this is where the creative aspect of it comes in, is because essentially your personal opinion is something that you're inventing. It's your persona, and while you may not necessarily agree with the opinion you're writing about, you can still use it in such a way where you're basically going, well, this is my opinion, live with it, suffer, whatever. So basically what you're doing is you're elaborating on that and you're being creative in the way that you express it. All right, let's move on to the types of language you can use. And essentially, like this little puppy dog, you can be formal or informal. Whether you use formal language is essentially depending on where it is going. So, and who your letter is directed at. So anyone in a formal capacity or who are unknown, you would write in a formal style. So if you're writing, for instance, to a mayor, a letter to the editor, a politician, someone prominent, someone respectable, someone who you haven't met before, you would always normally write in the formal style. If it's a pen pal, for instance, and if they still get questions like that, then you may not necessarily write in a formal style, but you would still sort of have a proper dear and from. Just to sort of say, well, I don't know you, but I'd like to get to know you a little bit better, so I'm going to be polite and do the right thing here. So, by writing in a formal style, it essentially means using formal language. You wouldn't go, hey dude, what's up? That's not what you would do in the formal styles. It just means that you are being careful, that you're using very exact and and direct English, that you're not going off and talking a lot of colloquialisms and the rest. If you're writing to a friend or family member, then of course you'll be writing informally. Don't write a formal letter for that because, as I said, it doesn't really make sense that you're writing formally to someone who's your best mate, apparently. So, as I said, depending on the style, it's just about using the right kind of language. Now, be careful when writing informally, because informally doesn't mean you write lazily or you write something that's complete gibberish. For instance, text or street language, now I'm showing my age a little bit here, but basically language that you would use in conversation with your friends is out. Because while this may be something, and if you're writing to a friend who's roughly your age, yeah, sure, they may understand it, but the thing is you're forgetting something. The marker, the teacher who won't understand a word of it. So you need to make sure that whatever you're writing, you still don't have text and street language, and believe it or not, I still come across it, so please don't. Even if I'm not marking your work, or I feel sorry for the teachers who are marking your work if you are going to use, it doesn't have to be vulgar language, but it does have to be language that we can read and we can understand. And certainly, it's one of the things that frustrates us as teachers is that young people, or teenagers, say I'm showing my age, basically will assume that we know exactly what you're talking about, when the truth is we don't. So make sure that the language you use is something that we can understand, that it sort of communicates with people who lived in the time of the dinosaurs and can sometimes speak like one too. Alright, let's move on. Now, the content of your letter should be direct and to the point, and no matter what style it is you're writing with, it needs to basically be a form of communication which doesn't take forever to get to the point. You need to avoid going off on tangents and focusing on relevant things, and this is a mindset you gotta have, is that whatever you start writing your letter about, you have to continue writing about it, and not go on to something else and start talking about your day or your week or anything else. So, if you're writing to someone to tell them to fix the highway and you're talking about birds being eaten by predators, you've probably gone a little bit off topic a little bit. So focus on making sure that what you're really discussing is essentially what needs to be said. Now it is, yes, a little bit boring if you do things that way. But the thing is, and this is the other more important thing, is you need to make your writing interesting. Just because the format isn't very interesting, and look, I'll be the first to admit that if I ask, or if someone asks me to write a letter to someone, I get bored to death. But that doesn't necessarily mean your answer has to be. And certainly you don't want to be writing a topic in such a way where you're boring the pants off a marker or a teacher. And certainly by marking about 50 letters or so, I start to fall asleep. So just because, as I said, the format isn't interesting and certainly doesn't give you as much variety as something else, like an essay, for instance, and even, yes, a letter does tend to make an essay look promising, but it doesn't mean that you can't experiment and play around with it a little bit. Now, how do I do this? How do I add interest? What do I do? Okay. First of all, you need to focus on having some big ideas. Which is, in other words, don't be satisfied with a simple response if there is a better one available. Now, what I mean by that is if I say the reason why we need to fix the roads and the highways is because people may die, that's a very simple response because you're only really focused on one thing. If you say that it is going to be better for everyone, and you're going to state that the reason why it's going to be better for everyone is because everyone uses the road, and then you start to list the people who use the road, and you start to do it in such a way where you're covering more ground, you're starting to vary your use of language, you're starting to really hit home passionately, almost, you can pretend to be passionate about it, all the things that essentially will be solved. You can almost say that this entire thing will be the answer to everything that is needed and everything that ever will be needed. And you can do it in such a way where you start to at least add a little bit of interest there. Of course, you can just write it in the style where you are an interesting person, where you have some odd quirks and personalities. Although, the one thing to avoid though is making it too over the top. So don't make it so extreme where you say that the reason why we need better roads is because of the fact that one day we'll have flying cars and so they want to be looking down on pretty roads. No, that's a bit too extreme. Add surprise and think about your audience. As I said, don't make it over the top again. So add something surprising, particularly if you've got an informal letter. but whatever it is, try and add something which is interesting and surprising. Something that's going to grab their attention, and particularly if you're writing a letter to the editor or a letter to a politician or something of that like, then you need to write about something which is going to get their attention. Now, yes, you can start the classic, your office is on fire, but the thing is, it probably would have been on fire for some time when they received the letter. What you do need to do is say, well, why is this issue going to affect you? Why is it going to be something that you should take an interest in? So think about them. Think about what it is that they are doing. Even if you're saying to a politician, this will further your career, then yes, be honest, do that. Now, emotion. Now, as I said before, because it's written from your personal opinion, your point of view. Now, it doesn't have to be your personal opinion. In other words, you can write it from a persona. And you can pretend to care. That's fine. As long as at least you try to pretend. You need to pretend to have some sort of emotion, or you need to show some sort of emotion in your written response. Now, as I said, all letters come from your own person, so they need to have an indication of how you may feel about a particular issue. So, if you're asked to write from someone's point of view, you need to express their feelings in the way that they feel about something. As I said before, you can simply pretend to be someone who cares. And that's completely fine, as long as you at least do attempt to do that. And say that this letter is written from the perspective of someone who really does care and really does feel passionately about the issue in such a way that they're able to talk about it, and they're able to really talk about it. Of course, one thing that I would advise you do, and again, don't care too much, don't go over the top with it again, because as I said, if you are going over the top, it makes it far-fetched, too unbelievable, and really starts to off-put whoever's marking your work. Now, of course, you may not come across letters as you go further and further through high school, but the one thing to remember is that this response is essentially something that applies to if you're doing a number of different things. Now, yes, these things still come up from time to time, and you're thinking, okay, well, how do I structure it? Well, the thing is, what another word for a letter is free writing. And there's one point I'll make here at the end, which is that when you're writing freely, obviously you get a lot more freedom in what you write about, your expression, everything else like that. But there are a lot more things that can go wrong. Which means what you need to do, and what you need to focus on, is making sure that you have a very clear, concise point of view, that you're expressing well, that you're expressing quite clearly, that you're not going off in various different directions, that you're not going, oh great, letter easy, I'm going to write down whatever comes to mind and then hand it in and go, well, that was done. You need to think about actually making it that you put an emphasis on at least delivering a decent response. And even though it's not an essay, you should still treat it with the seriousness that you treat an essay, but then try and add a little bit of fun into it as well. As long as I said, you don't go over the top and basically mess it all up. But otherwise, that's about it for letter writing. Until next time, I'll see you later.